What was World War II? Second World War? Great War? It's not as silly a question as it sounds. Until 1939, there had been a Great War, which we now know as the First World War or World War I. Only World War II appeared in the collective imagination sometime around 1940-41, when it was clear that the Great War was only the first war, and what we were in now in 1939 or 40 was something quite different. But even then, it wasn't quite sure what we were in. There was a war with the Russians in Finland. The Germans had invaded Poland. British and French forces had declared war on Germany. Italy would jump in 1940. Before the war had even started, Italy was fighting in Abyssinia. Japan was fighting in Manchuria. Russia was an ally, and then it wasn't an ally of Germany. The United States came in and came in late. So all of these different wars, 17 of them, were suddenly clumped together and said there is a Second World War that followed the First World War. But it was even stranger than that. There had never been a loss of life comparable to what transpired between 1939 and 1945. 50 to 70 million people were killed. More people that were killed in any other war. More people that were killed in any other single event since the Black Plague had struck Europe in the 14th century. The war was fought from Antarctica. The war was fought in South America. Not far from where I'm talking today, the Japanese shelled Santa Barbara. Every continent saw conflict, every religion, almost every people. There were 3 great holocausts. In fact, more people died in the 20th century off the battlefield than on it. 70, 80 million people were slaughtered by the Russian, Chinese, and German governments outside the sphere of conflict, and yet in some way they all had something to do with World War II. The final solution was cloaked by the barbarity of 13 million Germans forcibly sent back to Germany after the war. Or maybe it was the murder of 2 million Russian prisoners, or the sheer disasters on the Russian front that saw 4 and 5 million people killed per year. The world did not give the attention that it should to the final solution because there was so much death and rampage. It was beneath the veneer of popular knowledge, even information. By the same token, until 1939, Russia was a pariah. They had killed through purges and famines and forced relocations 20 million of their own people. And yet World War II rehabilitated Stalin in some sense and excused his behavior. At least he was the necessary ally for the Germans at one time and also for the British and the French and the Americans. Without World War II, Stalin would have faced the consequences of his acts far sooner. In some ways, the Chinese trumped both the Germans and the Russians. Between 1945 and 1970, probably 60 million Chinese were killed during the civil wars, the purges, the Great Leap Forward, the several 5-year plans, the Cultural Revolutions. And yet that too was mitigated by World War II because Chinese communism was birthed in World War II in opposition to Japanese fascism, and that gave it a sort of a pass in the West. So World War II permeates history in the 20th century, and it permeates the past, present, and future of Western civilizations. Whether we like it or not, all of the weapons, all of the political assumptions, they were Western to the core. Japan fought with Western weapons. Its idea of dictatorship and national racial superiority was borrowed in some sense from the Italians and the Germans. The most natural question, why did this war start? Why did everybody engage in a collective madness that would kill 50 or 60 or 70 million people within 5 years? There's a lot of different reasons, but it originally started over what we call the German problem. And the German problem had been Europe's problem since 1870. What do you do with a people of 70, 80 million population who can work and create goods and services, a gross national product that excels the per capita production of any other country in the vicinity? And at some point, don't countries with such economic clout and influence and power translate that to national prestige and military power? And that's what Germany had done as soon as it was unified in 1866 and 7. It had translated that dynamism into power, and the result was the defeat of France in 1871. And it had done it again in 1914 with the Schlieffen Plan and the invasion of Belgium, neutral at the time. And now here it was 1939, and Germany was once again telling its neighbors, and indeed the world at large, we are a powerful country and we want commiserate prestige and influence. And if we don't, we're going to use military power as methods of national objectives. So Germany, the German problem started most of the war. But it was more than the German problem this time around. There was a new nationalist ideology, Nazism. They had coined this old word in the German vocabulary, Volk, people. But it didn't just mean people. It meant that if you spoke German and you lived on German soil, you were not German. If you were a Jew or Hungarian German, you were not German. You had to look like a German. And what did that look like? You were an Aryan. In the same way that Mussolini said there was a Raza. You weren't just Italian if you spoke Italian or lived on the Italian peninsula. You had to look like an Italian in the way that the Japanese had the same concept. And what did this mean for war? It meant that two things. One, logic vanished. If you were to tell Mr. Tojo or Mr. Hitler or Mr. Mussolini that you do not have the manpower, you do not have the industrial potential, you don't have the military output of your rivals and you're going to lose these wars, they wouldn't have believed you, because they believed in the supernatural, the fantastic, that a German was worth 5 Frenchmen or a Japanese was worth 10 Chinese soldiers because they were racially pure. It was a very destructive ideology. 1918, Germany quit fighting. Its army was 70 miles into France and Belgium. And they claimed that it was an armistice, but the Allies did not need to go and occupy Germany and destroy its capital. This time they did, because Nazi ideology energized the German people in a way that Prussian militarism had not. So nationalist, racist ideology energized Germany and Italy and Japan in a way untrue of past conflicts. What were the aims besides the German problem? Of course, World War I. World War I permeated everybody's thinking in Europe. 9 million Europeans had died in the trenches. It warped particular views. In the case of the United States, it said that the United States did not want to participate again because World War I hadn't solved anything. Here they go again, the Europeans fighting. For what? The Germans had surrendered, as I said, 70 miles inside Belgium and France. And their way of thinking, we didn't lose the war. After all, people on the offensive in enemy territory won. We were stabbed in the back. The Jews did it, the socialists did it, the communists did it. Had Marshal Foch or General Pershing convinced Woodrow Wilson and the other allies that they should have gone in 1918, November, December, January, marched into Berlin, which everybody knew they could, and forced the Germans to accept an unconditional surrender, things might have been different. One of the great ironies was the people who won World War I, the French, the British, and the Americans, came away demoralized and disillusioned in their victory. And the people who lost it, the German speakers of Austria and Germany, came away confident that next time they would do much better. So World War I permeated all the thinking, strategic, tactical, political, cultural, social, in 1939. Now, a lot of people point to the Versailles Treaty, the treaty that officially ended World War I in 1919 after the armistice of 1918. And the common argument is it was too harsh. It put all of the onus on Imperial Germany. It said, you started the war, we're going to take the Alsace-Lorraine, we're going to create Poland, take away most of Prussia, we're going to make you pay reparations. That was supposed to be cruel, and that caused anger, and Hitler, being the political genius as he was, took advantage of that. Nothing could be further from the truth. The worst thing about Versailles, and it was a bad treaty, wasn't that it treated Germany harshly, but it treated Germany harshly and humiliated it without the ability to enforce those edicts. If you compare the Versailles Treaty and the treatment accorded Germany to what Germany had imposed on France in 1871, it was mild. If you look at the Versailles Treaty compared to what Britain and the United States and Russia imposed on Nazi Germany in defeat in 1945, it was mild. But what was wrong about the Versailles Treaty, it said to the German people, you started the war, you're going to have to pay us for it, and we don't really have any means of enforcing these edicts, and we're tired of war, and we're going to leave you alone to your own auspices, and we're not going to occupy you, and we're not going to force you to change your government in a way that we find politically expedient. for our national interest. And the result was Hitler was able to fabricate this fantasy that they were never beaten, they were subject to a mean peace treaty, they were on the offensive in enemy territory, and we had this stage set for the occupation of the Rhineland, the Saarland plebiscite, the Anschluss with Austria, the destruction of Czechoslovakia and the German protectorate in Bohemia and Moravia, and eventually invasion of Poland. At any key point, these could have been stopped. Which brings up an additional reason that World War II started. A much more likely reason than the harshness of the Versailles Treaty was appeasement. Remember, appeasement was a good word originally. It said, trying not to be mean when you negotiate with somebody, hoping that your magnanimity will be taken account of, and then you will get a reciprocal dialogue that ensues. Magnanimity was looked as weakness by Hitler. You cannot dialogue with a cobra. That's what appeasement turned out to be. So each of these critical junctures, when the Allies, Britain and France, had they been able to bring in America, all the better, could have said to Hitler, do not militarize the Rhineland. Keep out of the Saarland. Do not unify with Austria. Do not absorb Czechoslovakia. Hitler would have imploded. Even his own generals did not want him to succeed in many cases. Now you're going to say, well, how could they have done that? Well, they could have done that because they had a much larger army, they had a better air force, they had a bigger navy. Hitler really did not obtain military parity till 1939, and he humiliated his enemies. Hitler was not as strong as the French army. His Mark III tank was not as good as a French Char tank. His generals were not necessarily better than British generals. Hitler was not a better strategist than Churchill. And yet he had one thing that all of the Allies lacked. He wanted to fight, he wanted to win, and he felt that he could win and he could fight well beyond his material resources. So he always overestimated his own forces, and ironically so did his enemies. When Hitler had 2,000 tanks, the French were convinced he had 7. When he had 3,000 artillery pieces on the west, the French were convinced he had 5. And so appeasement was one of the great causes of World War II, and we should keep that in mind in all conflicts.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
There's a couple of other reasons why this war started. They're very important. One is the role of Russia. Remember in World War I, Germany had a two-front war, a fact that was imprinted, seared into Hitler's brain as a corporal on the Western Front. They had to fight the Tsar's army with 200 divisions, and they had 200 divisions on the West fighting Britain and France and later America. Never again, they said, they would ever get themselves in a situation. France had always depended on one fact: we cannot survive Germany unless Russia is an ally. We have to have that two-front. Hitler knew that. So what he wanted to do, even though he had formed a pact, the Rome, Berlin, Tokyo axis, he double-crossed his two allies and made a deal with Russia. In August of 1939, the German foreign ambassador and the Russian foreign ambassador, Mr. Ribbentrop, Mr. Molotov, signed a non-aggression pact. The moment they signed that, Poland was doomed and the war was sure to start because there was no limitation in the East on Hitler. In fact, he made a deal as part of the pact that Russia would split Poland up. Imagine that. Russia, of all places. Communist Russia was going to split Poland up with its fascist enemy and then have a free hand to absorb the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia and start a war with Finland. All the while Hitler would be secure on his east. If he was secure on his east, he would have a one-front war fighting in the west against France. Now, another thing to remember is Russia made a pact with every other combatant, and it usually broke its word. At least it broke its word to the Allies more than it did to the Axis that it fought. In 1939, it made a pact with Germany and it said, we will not attack you, we will send you iron ore, wheat, coal, oil, and you can use that to attack the democracies of the West. It was perfectly willing to keep its bargain with Hitler. Hitler attacked Russia on June 21st of 1941. Russia did not attack it. It made a deal with Japan in April of 1941. And Germany was surprised. Japan has a non-aggression pact? Russia made a pact with us after it was invaded. It came back to Britain and it came back to the United States and said, I wasn't really on Hitler's side, please help me. and it would do that throughout the war. It kept its word with Germany until it was attacked. It kept its word with Japan most of the time until the very end of the war. It never kept its word with us. As soon as the war was over, it absorbed Eastern Europe and began the Cold War. The role of Russia helped start World War II. Had it not signed the non-aggression pact with Germany, there would not have been a war. There was one other reason that World War II broke out, and that was the United States. As long as Russia was a de facto neutral or an ally with Germany, Germany could not easily be defeated by France and Britain. But as long as the United States was neutral, they also would not lose that war. And if the United States had intervened quickly in 1939 on the side of Britain and France, Hitler would have never gone into Western Europe, and it's very dubious whether Russia had remained an ally of Germany. Russia became an ally of Germany because they were convinced Germany was going to win, and they were convinced Germany was going to win because Britain and France didn't seem like they could adopt a foreign policy other than appeasement. American isolationism then encouraged Germany, and it encouraged Japan. What were the aims of the war? If we know what the causes were, what did people want out of this war? Why did they try to seek political objectives by military means? What did the Axis want? To go to Italy, or we go to Germany, or we're going to Japan in 1939 or 1940. They wanted a regional hegemony, and they wanted to work in concert to overthrow the existing boundaries and world order that had grown up under British imperialism and the so-called peace after 1918. For Japan, it was a free hand in China, and most of the Pacific all the way to Hawaii was going to be their own regional lake, so to speak. And with the absence of British, Dutch, and French colonialism, they would have the necessary rubber, oil, bauxite, iron ore, and fuels to feed their quite impressive munitions industries and indeed their economy at large. What did Italy want? Italy in some ways was the most lunatic. Although it had 40 million people, it was in some ways a pre-industrial state. It could build impressive battleships, it could build impressive planes, but not in quantity and reliability. It had no military record that was impressive. But yet it felt that if it allied itself with the fascist powers, and Britain were to be defeated, and France were to be defeated, there would not be a British fleet in the Mediterranean, there would not be a French fleet, and there would be colonies to pluck, whether Egypt or Libya or Tunisia, and Mussolini would recreate what he called Mare Nostrum, the old Latin phrase of our sea, which the Romans had called the Mediterranean. For Hitler, we don't quite know what he thought when he invaded Poland. He didn't think it would end up in a world war. He felt, according to the tenets of Mein Kampf, that he would have a sphere of influence, first of all, in Eastern Europe. And anybody who spoke German, whether they're in Czechoslovakia or Prussia or Poland or Austria, would be in a Reich. They would all be members of an 80 million German empire.
That every person of German blood, no matter where he lived, belonged to the Nazi Reich.
They would absorb, through client dictators, Eastern Europe, and they would be eventually successful absorbing the Ukraine and the Slavic parts of Western Russia. They would build a 6-lane highway to the Black Sea, and from Berlin all the way to Moscow would be German territory. That was pretty much what Hitler said he was going to do. In his mind, he never quite thought that he would ever have to invade France, or he'd have to invade Belgium or Denmark. That only occurred when the inexplicable happened. Russia said to him, "We'll make an alliance with you." Once that happened, he put on hold his plans to absorb Eastern Europe and Russia, and he turned his attention westward. He was very reluctant to do that, because remember, he'd fought 4 years in the West in World War I, the Germans had, and they could not win. They'd fought 2.5 in Russia, and they had won. So in Hitler's mind, it is unite German speakers around a Reich, the third one in its glorious history, create a client kingdom of Eastern Europe, and then start expropriating land from Slavic Russia under the auspice of German colonists. If you add up all of these fantastic designs, these agendas, they all have one thing in common again, that fascism, which had survived the Depression through military spending and public works, was a superior form of government than were the democracies. The democracies had won World War I and felt they had lost it. The fascists felt that they were more technologically advanced, they had more national will, they had added a new element of racial solidarity, and they were the wave of the future, and they were going to make law according to their commiserate power. So they all had a common ideology, they had common agendas. One thing they did not have in common, they could not work together, because they were dictators, and as dictators they were by nature inveterate liars. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, Hitler said, "Where's Pearl Harbor?" He didn't know where it was. He didn't know the Japanese had done that. When Japan was fighting Russia and all of a sudden Germany, its allies, suddenly made a non-aggression pact with Russia, Japan said, "Why did they do this?" Hitler had no idea that Mussolini was going to declare war on France on June 10th of 1940. He had no idea they were going to invade the Balkans. He had no idea what their plans were to go into Egypt. So each of the axis, even though they were ideologically akin, had nothing in common because they were naturally suspicious states. Contrast that with the Allies. They had nothing in common. Britain went into the war to do what? To save the notion of the British Empire. The colonizing and positive effects of going around the world and teaching people British law, British language, and British customs and manners. The civilizing mission of the British Empire. They wanted that system to survive the war. Why did Russia finally join the Allies in June of 1941? Well, they wanted to make sure that Soviet communism that was teetering, because it was a failed system before the war, would survive, and they never wanted to have an independent Eastern Europe between Russia and Germany again. They went into the war to eject the Germans out of Russia, but to ensure that Eastern Europe all the way to the Elbe River would be under Russian control, and better yet, all of Germany. Why did the United States go to war? For a very principled idea that there would be a post-war United Nations, there would be democratic capitalism throughout the world, and people would emerge from this war with the same opportunity for leisure, affluence, freedom, liberty that American citizens had. Those three Allied agendas were incompatible. Even though the Axis were compatible and didn't work together, the Allies were incompatible, but they worked wonderfully together.
The Allied invasion of North Africa, which would call for preparations on a scale never before equaled in military history.
The Americans worked in North Africa with the British. 2 out of 3 people in the German army who would die in the Eastern Front. And at a series of conferences in Casablanca and Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam, they worked and synchronized their strategy. It all fell apart after the war, but during the war, they were quite idealistic. Finally, why was World War II so destructive? Why did it kill 50 to 70 million people? You can say, well, it was fought on all the continents and there was more people involved. But 2 reasons explain it. One I hinted at earlier, it was ideologically driven. People were not going to surrender as had happened in World War I. You had to destroy not only a German or an Italian fascist, but you had to destroy fascism or Nazism or Japanese militarism. It energized people to fight to the last man, and it made it much more difficult because it said to the Allies, you not only have to beat us, but you have to defeat us, humiliate us, occupy us, and eradicate our ideology. And that meant the war was fiercely contested than in the past, and it had to go on much longer. The second was technology. 20 years had happened between World War I and World War II. The speed of aircraft had increased. The lethality of ships had increased. The ballistics on artillery, mortars, tanks had increased. World War I had been fought almost without air power. It was an afterthought in 1917 and 1918. There were no 4-engine bombers. There was no concept of sonar or radar. There was no guided missiles. There were no cruise missiles. And most importantly, there were no atomic bombs. There was no napalm. World War II happened in the mid-20th century, right on the cusp of a technological revolution. And what that meant is the greatest minds in Western civilization took a hiatus from research and applied their talents and their genius to making weapons of death and mass destruction. And the war ended with jet planes, atomic bombs, guided missiles. This was a war that had started with cavalry in Poland fighting tanks.